I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am before I get started. I am Rob Carter. I've had an interesting life. In fact, I was made in Taiwan back many years ago. My father was a military officer, and we lived all over the world for the first part of my life. So, grew up in kind of a diverse world of looking out in places like Taiwan and the Philippines and Europe, and have really enjoyed having that initial lens on the world through a pretty diverse perspective. We landed in Tampa Bay. He retired at Central Command, working for General Schwarzkopf back in the day there at MacDill Air Force Base. And so I grew up in Central Florida on the Gulf of Mexico, there in St. Petersburg, Florida, and you know, frankly, the life that I lived during those days is not the person that you see in front of you now. I came to Christ fairly late in my life. We didn't have a particularly religious upbringing. There wasn't much about the way we lived that really did anything to focus on who Christ is and what he can be to us. So I was 25 years old when I came to know Jesus, which is later than many, but I've got to tell you that, as I described, this isn't a testimony. It's a little different than that, but as I describe who I am, almost everything good that ever happened to me happened after that moment in time. It was a bit of a road to Damascus conversion for me. The life I was living was not one that I'll even recount to you, not one that I'm proud of, but I'm a new creation in Christ from that day forward, and life got way more interesting, way more exciting, really a lot more to it than what I believed life was all about up to that point in time. So when Howard asked me to do this, first off, it took me about a nanosecond to recognize that the center was going to be an important part of business leadership and leadership for men in the city. When Kim and Howard came to me and asked me if I would help support it, I said, what a great idea. I've come to know Howard most recently through his work at PDS, where my youngest son goes to school these days. But it didn't take me long to say yes to this event, because frankly, I think back on lots of times in my life where people have shared something with me that I ended up finding important. And so when I thought about what would I share with a group of men like the folks that are associated with and attending the center, and I said, well, what I really need to share is the constructs of my walk with Christ that have been most important to me. If I can share just one thing, impart one thing about what's been important to me, about how my walk with Christ has affected my career, my life, my family, I would do that with you today. And so I have a fairly brief construct here. I hope this will end up being a conversation rather than some long sermon-y kind of event from me. But it's important for me to unpack this one set of constructs for you, which have been everything to how my career has unfolded and how my life has unfolded. So I want to start off with one simple scripture, and that is Psalm 90:17. And Psalm 90:17 says, "Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon me, and establish the work of my hand for me." Yes, establish the work of my hands. And so the reason that I picked that verse is it's really got two super important constructs for it. And I want to start with establish first. Establish the work of my hands. So establish is an interesting word, right? It's not God, do my work for me. It doesn't have anything that even sounds like that. But what it is it's to plant, to affirm, to establish, to construct, to lay a foundation for the work of my hands. And it doesn't say, help me do that. It says specifically, establish the work of my hands for me. Yes, establish the work of my hands. So this is something that God does for us. It's not something that, I think too many of us spend a lot of time really trying to spin and find that establishment of the work which would be our life's work, and not recognize that the fundamental underlying foundational construct of your work and your life is God's calling on your life. And that calling doesn't have to be ministry. I think too often we sort of associate calling only with ministry. But from that point in time when I was 25 to this very day, I felt this sure calling on my life that God wanted me to be a leader in business who was a Christian, who would extol the virtues and set the example for Christianity in the workplace. That was my calling. And there were other things about that, specific talents that, that God had called me to embrace. But the establishment of that work was by God's hands, not by mine. He established the work for me. But then let's rewind the tape a little bit into this verse. Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands for us. So why do you think that it would start with let the beauty of God rest on us as part of the establishment of the work of our hands? What's a word that we often use for beauty? Especially I think this is we talk about women in this regard a lot, and it's one of the the highest orders of beauty that we assign to women. What's a word that we use for she is full of, or she is graceful? I think when it's a great, but there's this element of beauty or favor that rests on this very notion of grace. And so grace and graceful is something that is a word that we ascribe to beauty or favor, which are the two things that word, that charis word in the Bible translates to. So it's about grace. So we've already established that this calling is from God, and that now we're talking about what is it that rests upon us when we go about that calling. And I want to make just a little bit of an argument with you that is God's grace that rests upon us, and that the most powerful life that you can live is a life where you're fulfilling the calling that God has given you, and you're leaning on the grace that God imparts to us. So there's a little bit of an alternate definition of grace that I want to share with you. I mean, we all sort of have this embedded notion of what God's grace is, and there's a definition that's at the tip of all of our tongues all the time, and that is God's unmerited favor, right? Well, I want to propose to you that while that's certainly not wrong, that there's a really key set of grace components that are wrapped up in God's unmerited favor, there's also a bigger definition of grace, and I'll use a few examples to show you what I mean. But the definition for grace that has powered me forward for so many years now is grace is God's empowering presence, enabling me to be who God created me to be and to do what He has called me to do. And I'm going to give you a few examples of where that fits And it really does fit in some important ways. And there's some places where you'll read, if you're spending time in the Word and reading, where you might want to test this definition as opposed to always using God's unmerited favor. I'll start with one in the Old Testament when Zechariah was writing about Zerubbabel's work to build the temple, and he says in Zechariah 4:7, he says, "Who are you, O great mountain, that you would exalt yourself against God? Zerubbabel with his hand will lay waste to you, and you'll become as a plain, and he'll bring forth the capstone of it with shouts of grace to it." So it's one of the very first uses of the word grace in the Bible, and those shouts of grace aren't about God's unmerited favor. It's about God's favor and empowering presence, enabling Zerubbabel and the work to be established to bring forth the capstone of the temple with shouts of grace to it. I'm going to give you a few New Testament examples. So one of the most famous ones that we know of that uses the word grace is, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, that of the only begotten Son, full of grace and truth." So when we tend to think of Jesus, we don't tend to think of him being full of God's unmerited favor. We tend to think of him as being full of God's empowering presence, the Godhead, the God-man among us, giving that empowering presence that enabled him to do everything that he was created to do. In James, we read that God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I'm not sure that God gives his unmerited favor to the humble as much as he gives his empowering presence, enabling those who will humble themselves under his mighty hand to be everything that God created them to be and to do everything that God's called them to do. So what I'm sharing with you here is that there's this very notion of grace and calling that go hand in hand. God's beauty resting upon us, his favor and his grace enabling us to be everything that we've been created to be and to do the work that he's called us to do, that he's established for us. That establishment is absolutely critical. So as we walk, this life, and as we do this work, I think too often we try and scan the horizon and figure out what is it that we're supposed to be doing. And I got to tell you that there's a really important notion of being led towards your calling, that established work that God has prepared for you, rather than necessarily things that we see around us on a regular basis. And so here's one way to think about that I think is important and probably will resonate with you. So when opportunity comes our way, when we are really struggling with decisions, I think we all get the fact that we should ask God to go before us. God is a way maker. He's the one that will prepare a way for us if it's in his will. And then when that happens, we get the opportunity to be full of grace as we go follow that opportunity. Because God gives us a measure of grace according to the purposes for which we are called, according to the measure of Christ's gift in us. God gives each of us a measure of grace according to the gifts that we have. So if we are following that calling, and if we are leaning into the things that God has for us, we get the opportunity to be graceful. Graceful. So graceful existence is one that flows effectively. Gracefulness is the opportunity to walk with that beauty resting upon us. Graceful. But what's the opposite of graceful? Disgrace. Disgrace. Yeah, disgrace is that place where grace has been removed. Because that measure of grace comes to us according to the purposes for which we've been called. God gives us a specific measure of His empowering presence according to the purposes for which we've been called. But there are many, many examples where if you step out of that calling and you're pursuing something that is different than that calling, whether it's in your life, your work, your family, what often follows is disgrace. The fact that that grace, that empowering presence becomes kind of Ichabod, kind of removed at that point in time. So the whole point of anything that I would tell you about this one thing that has powered me for a long time now was this revelation that God's grace comes in measure when we're willing to humble ourselves and follow the calling that He has on our lives. So God resists the proud. When we're pridefully seeking things that are of our own doing and idea, but He gives grace to the humble. And so I really love the idea of living a graceful life, of having that beauty rest upon me that the Lord our God gives to us because we're following the work which He has established for us. That establishment is not our own doing. It's work that God has put in front of us. Establish the work of our hand for us. Yes. Establish the work of our hands. So the conversation from here can go anywhere you want it to. That was a little bit of a sermon, but the idea was that it just encapsulate. I mean, every step, every opportunity that's come my way now. I've had this incredible opportunity at FedEx. I came here in 1993. Happened to love the city of Memphis, by the way. I mean, I'm not a native Memphian, didn't grow up here, but I really love Memphis. It's, people often ask me where I will retire to, and I say, well, this is home for me. I love our city. But the opportunities that came to me were taps on the shoulder that I wasn't looking for. And as I got the opportunity to come here and work for FedEx, I joined the company, and great things began to happen to me. In 1997, I became the Chief Technology Officer for the company at that point in time, right as FDX Corporation was forming. We had just become more than the Federal Express company that was born here. We acquired what is now FedEx Ground and FedEx Freight and FedEx Logistics, and so I was one of the early people that came to the corporate headquarters. But then began to work directly for Fred as the Chief Information Officer in the year 2000. So now 20 years later, working as part of the Strategic Management Committee and XCOM at FedEx, working directly for Fred all these years, I believe I'm the longest sitting CIO in the Fortune world. CIO usually means career is over, and so, but not only is it an interesting, opportunity to work for Fred. The work that we do with technology is fascinating. It is one of the coolest places in the world to apply technology to the world that we operate in. So for me, that all represented my calling, the things that I had done. Even though I wasn't a Christian when I was coming through college, I kind of bombed out of my pre-med curriculum and was dangling by a thread at the University of Florida, and this guidance counselor was looking at me and said, frankly, Mr. Carter, based on your decisions so far and the results so far, I'm not sure you've got what it takes to be successful here at the University of Florida. It was my freshman story at the University of Florida. And my dad was saying very similar things to me at the time. I was like, this isn't working out like we planned. But so I'd never touched a computer in my life, but as a freshman, I just kind of said, well, why don't I give computers a try? And that ended up being part of the establishment of my calling, because I had no clue why I was doing that or what the purpose was. And so even though I wasn't a Christian at the time, God's hand was on his life, steering me towards a point where that would become meaningful work for me, and I could apply that calling and some gracefulness around it to lead me in this walk. So let me take a breath there and see if anybody on the Zoom or any of you, here have any questions about FedEx, about how this story unfolded, or even about this alternative notion of grace being God's empowering presence. And I'm going to try and not make it too weird, try and make it as concrete as possible. But part of the answer that I would give you to that question is that when we humble ourselves before God, he makes things particularly clear to us that wouldn't otherwise be clear. Of my own. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. 2010, the world was obviously changing really quickly when it came to technology and the technology landscape. But we had, what was our legacy of technology was actually becoming our enemy rather than our friend. So we had a lot of legacy technologies, a lot of things that were not fit for purpose for the world that was emerging. And so I could, it's what I call seeing the David. When Michelangelo was hired, in Florence by the town council to carve the David for the Duomo, his interview was really simple. He wasn't a well-known artist at all. He went in front of the council. They had fired one guy already. If you've ever seen the David, he's got one really big hand, and they recognized that was what the first guy did. They recognized that he was screwing it up, and so they fired him, and they were looking for someone else. And Michelangelo's interview was really cool, because he said, "I can see the David in there, you just need to hire me to let him out." And so seeing the David is this really powerful construct, and God gives us all the ability to see things that others can't see. And so again, I know this seems like an indirect answer to your question, but it became really clear to me in 2010 that we had to embark on an aggressive campaign to get rid of things that were working. They weren't broken. They were, but they weren't going to be what we needed in 2020 when the pandemic struck and when we had these massive surges of volume. So we began a decade-long journey. And I got the opportunity with the board, with Fred, with the executive team, and with all of the business to describe a future that was different than the one that we were living in. And it wasn't a bad decision or a good decision. It was more of a revelation that I had about saying, look, we got to steer this thing in a different direction. It's not a crisis. The platform's not on fire. We're not waiting until it's too late. We're going to start this journey early. And so we started building assets in our technology suite that were much more cloud-like, much more adaptable, and it's today what technology teams call cloud native and API first and mobility. All of those things became part of what we started to build. But it wasn't the fact that I had made a bad or a good decision then, really, as much as it was that because I think I was following the calling and had God's empowering presence enabling me to be who he created me to be and do what he called me to do, I sort of could see something coming that was really important. And as we sit here today in the midst of the pandemic, and with the we have smashed through every record this week that FedEx ever set. It's a quiet period. I can't give you too much, but the Cyber Week volumes are insane. They're just nuts. The technology against the backdrop of those surges far more than the actual shipping volume does. So technology intensity is even greater than the surge in package volume because people become much more interested. We did, yesterday, we did almost 3/4 billion tracks. So 750 million tracks of people, out there looking for where their shipments are. And trust, we didn't move 750 million packages, but that surge is even greater than the surge in the volume that we saw. And the old infrastructure, the old technologies, the things would have never been able to deal with these kinds of volumes. And so we've been able to fairly quickly adapt the business to this world that we're living in. And I really don't think you can fake it, when something this real happens, whether you're either ready or you're not. Now, the career choices were probably some of the biggest ones. I actually, at one point in time, I guess I'll tell this story in a super abbreviated way, but I was, right as 2000 was rolling around, you remember this was the internet bubble. There was all kinds of stuff going on in the internet world at that point in time. And I had a job offer to go do something, something different. And it was, it was a great opportunity. And I was seriously considering it. And it became abundantly clear to me that I should stay the course at FedEx, and it wasn't 2 weeks later than that my predecessor left, and I was named the CIO of the business, which was frankly my dream job, and still is to this day. And so, sometimes it's really just saying, God, is this, or is this you calling me, or is this my own pride and ambition, driving me to be somewhere other than where you'd have me? Failures come at us through, all kinds of lenses, some of them completely out of our control. And, there's this rooting in establishment. Colossians 2:7 says, rooted in him and strengthened, built up in the faith as you were taught, and overflowing with thankfulness. Rootedness is the single most important answer to that question. Being able to withstand, the storms and the trials and travails, and none of us should consider it unusual when those storms come. But rootedness is particularly important. Some of you, heard and know the story that my oldest child died when he was 10, and it was, it was completely unexpected. It was something that was the most devastating failure because I was in Hong Kong. What was I doing in Hong Kong? So the blame and the failure and the and for my wife, she was right there with him. So for a mother and a father, they were probably the two most significant, perspectives on failure. Mom saying, why didn't I know that he was so sick? Me saying, what am I doing on the exact opposite side of the planet? And it's not that those kinds of things don't just, absolutely shatter the foundation of your faith, but shatter, sometimes that foundation or attempt to, but being able to recognize God's sovereignty in the most difficult times is part of being rooted. And so, I was feeling incredibly sorry for myself. I was feeling like God had betrayed me, because probably my most fervent prayer always was, protect my children. And it was another one of those points of revelation where God gave me, first off, and it took a while. It wasn't like immediate. It took a little while to say, I understand how angry you are with me, And when are you going to admit it? You know, I didn't feel like that there was room as a Christian to be angry with God and question him. You know, I mean, the Job style, you know, questioning of God's will and God's purpose in my life. But it was only when I said, you know, really kind of threw it on the table and said, I can't believe how betrayed I feel. I can't believe how let down I am. And this overwhelming sense of God saying, you know what? I know what it feels like to lose your son. And there were no arms big enough to wrap around me at that point in time. There was no love great enough. And it wasn't that we don't all know the end of the story and that resurrection was on the other side of that. But there was that moment in time for God where that separation from his only son was completely real and completely total. And you know, that's the kind of loss. You know, I think I know the end of the story for my son and my life too, is that yes, there'll be a time when we're back together again. But the ability to weather those storms is all about being honest with God, being rooted and strengthened in him, and just, you know, doing everything that you can. You know, we too often we tend to think of all things work together for the good of those who believe and are called according to his purposes. You know, sometimes that's a really good news thing. You know, when you're called according to God's purposes, a lot of great things ultimately end up happening, even though we go through some pretty darn serious speed bumps and failures. Yeah, it's really, really important. And so of late, you know, during the pandemic, and it's interesting how this started. It's another one of those things that I just kind of count as God's grace, you know, sort of leading me through. But at the beginning of Lent this year, which was really prior to the pandemic breaking out, it was in February, you know, at some point, I usually give something up for Lent, and this year, instead of giving something up, well, it was give something up, but it was give up a half hour of sleep and time in the morning. So I committed at the beginning of Lent that I was going to get up a half hour earlier, and I was going to fast. I wasn't going to go eat breakfast. I wasn't going to go do anything. I was going to go straight, and I was going to read and study and build myself up through spending time. So I still count it as not as giving something up, but as giving something back. I was going to, you know, how gracious of me to give back to God a little bit of my time, so that He can pour into me. You know, I mean, but I did that and have been doing it ever since. And it's not like I've never had seasons in my life where I had that kind of devotional, but it's wound up being particularly powerful throughout this time. In fact, the very first thing that God put on my heart was to memorize the 91st Psalm. So we looked at Psalm 90:17, which is, "Let your beauty be on me and establish the work of my hands for me." Well, that's the last verse of 90. It rolls right into the 91st Psalm. And the 91st Psalm has things like, "Because you have made the Lord your habitation, no evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling, for He will give His angels charge over you to keep you in all your ways. And you need not be afraid of the terror by night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the perilous pestilence that walks in darkness." You know, I mean, all that was the richness of what God had put on my heart as all of a sudden this pandemic explodes. You know, I'm kind of going, well, that was pretty amazing that, you know, that all of that was just being put on my heart, and then it became really useful, you know, at the time. And it's, you know, I know this thing's affecting people in incredibly different ways, but you know, there are some if you want to pray up around the pandemic and around protection, spend time in the 91st Psalm. It is kind of it's the best of the best when it comes to, you know, kind of having that hedge of protection around you and your family. You know, it's so funny because everything that has become particularly, this is almost the same kind of thing. You know, we had these insights into what the world was going to need, but they were going to require significant investments in front of that need. And so the things that were troubling the world and investors and everyone else were that we were spending too much capital to grow our networks. We were trying to figure out how to solve for an e-commerce world that was very different than the world that we came from. We were predominantly a business-to-business organization globally, but we could see the fact that e-commerce was going to grow and continue to grow into the future. And so we began to do things like build out the 7-day network, build out the retail networks, all kinds of things that we were building to say we've got our last mile optimization to be able to funnel stuff from express into ground to serve residential deliveries with a higher degree of density, pulling back all of the postal service deliveries that we were using, something called Smart Post, driving them into the FedEx ground network in order to create density. Because when you run a network business, density is everything. The distance between stops, the number of packages you can deliver at an individual stop, that's how you make money at it. Not, you know, you can't do it if you're running residential and rural routes with very low density and very lightweight shipments. We've walked away from Amazon. We said, okay, Amazon's actually not our friend. We walked away from more than $1 billion worth of business from Amazon, you know, kind of at the drop of a hat. And, you know, all of that stuff was being criticized. Every bit of it was being criticized. Well, it ended up being you know, now UPS is, I'll say this out loud, they're in a trick bag. 1 out of 4 packages that they move in the US is an Amazon package. Amazon is taking the best of the volume away from them with the silver blue vans and relegating them to less dense, lower weight routes out in, you know, rural and suburban areas, while you know, they are incredibly good with data, so they're grabbing all of the luscious, dense routes inside of urban and suburban areas and taking that for themselves and relegating the rest of it to their carriers. We saw that coming. We could see it in the data. We could see them hollowing out our routes. It's what we called the donut. You know, they were taking the whole of the donut and they were relegating us, and we were going, we're not going to do that for you. Hello, you know, we're not going to do that. And they said, well, sure you are. You can't live without us, you know. And we said, well, probably can. And so we walked away at a point in time where it was meaningful, you know, $1 billion worth of actually not horrible business at that point in time. It was, you know, but it was just, you know, it was getting worse, and the writing was on the wall. They were going to continue to grow their network. They're even likely to compete with us directly as a common carrier. They'd filed that in one of their SEC filings, you know, and we found it, you know, and said, well, they filed for, you know, common carrier privileges, which means any to any, you know, kinds of things, not just their own traffic outbound. So. So yeah, it was wild, and it was a little depressing at the time. And then the pandemic hit, and every bit of it paid off in spades in ways where we had the capacity, we had the technology, we had, you know, the routing systems, we had the ability to hand off between the networks. We didn't need their volume anymore, you know, as part of it. That's not the whole story, but we didn't need that anymore. You know, the quarter that we announced, you know, prior to this one showed us growing by $2 billion. Well, what didn't get reported was that was the sequential, that was the year-over-year quarter where we had walked away from $1 billion worth of Amazon business. We actually grew by 3, not 2, because we covered up the loss of the Amazon business and then grew 2 more. So one thing about me, and I can look anyone in the eye and say this, is I'm actually not a workaholic. I don't believe that we're ever at our best just burning our nose on the grindstone. I don't think that's what causes creativity. I don't think that's what causes, breakthrough. I don't think that's what gives you time to seek God and get revelation about, your calling and how to let a graceful existence work through you. So I'm not someone, I kind of counter this notion that being an executive in a demanding business like ours means that you have to work 80 hours a week. I don't do that. I might get fired for that. I'm not sure why I haven't, but I'm not lazy either. So here's my mantra in that regard. And this is, I said this one time when I was speaking up at Rensselaer Polytech, and the president of Rensselaer sits on our board, Shirley Jackson, and she sent me this plaque back because one of the kids had asked me, said, what's your mantra? And I kind of went, better think up one really quick. But it stuck, and it's that, and this is my mantra: work hard, lead a balanced life, and have an undying respect for people. And so my mantra is, I love the outdoors. I love to hunt. We have a farm, outside of town that we spend a lot of time at. It's been a real treasure in the pandemic. I really have wonderful friends, that I know that, I think it's so important for men in particular to know, at least the 3 people that you could pick up the phone at 2 o'clock in the morning and call, and they would drop anything and do whatever they can for you. Friends matter a lot. And just leading a balanced life is actually a really critical notion of how to be most effective in my way of thinking anyways. I think you have to have a balanced life where family and faith and, not faith and family and friends and then FedEx, in that order, are actually how you order your life. But I don't have this all figured out. I meant to say, I was even in my notes at the beginning, so make sure to tell these guys that you do not have the world wired or figured out. Every day presents new challenges, but I do find that, leaning hard on God's calling and His grace is what helps navigate the complexities of every day. Right before that says, I think it's 90:10. In fact, I'm almost sure it is 90:10 in Psalm says, and teach us to number our days, O Lord, that we might gain a heart of wisdom. You have to, every day matters, and numbering your days, gaining a heart of wisdom. What in the world? Gain a heart of, our hearts are like a bouquet of things that, joy and grace and wisdom. These are things that God can help us gain in our heart, but He tells us specifically, make your days matter. Number the day. Spend time in a devotional every day, and make that day matter. Yeah, it's over as many years as I've been doing this job anyways, it becomes kind of apparent, I don't spend a lot of time at work, and I don't necessarily think it would be appropriate for me to do this, proselytizing. I'm not wearing my Christianity right on my sleeve every day at work. And while I can come in here and talk a lot about Scripture and a lot about God's Word and a lot about what it means to me, those are special times, when you get the opportunity to do that. And I think God reveals those opportunities to you. So it's, and Lord knows I've, made enough blunders with, bad language and bad decisions, and, so sometimes that beauty, gets a little scuffed up, but that's part of walking the walk, I think, too. And, I don't, sometimes I think we think about the world in a little bit too pristine a way, and I think about Jesus' walk, and He's often, was often criticized for hanging out with, tax collectors and prostitutes. And I think he was pretty real. I mean, I think, I think he wasn't here to just hang out with, with the pious among us. In fact, he seemed to have a significant disdain for the pious among us, and really was trying to reach a world that needed to be reached. So life's pretty real for all of us, I think. Yeah, wow. And again, that was probably why I jumped on the opportunity to help support it, because there's such a need. I mean, businesses themselves, have their armor up so high, to ward off faith and to keep it out of the workplace. And so, I don't agree with that, but I don't think that's a fight that we have to fight every day, as long as we can, as long as we can come together as believers in safe places, and and you learn about each other in ways. And at FedEx, I know who the faithful are, who the Christians are in the midst, the people that I could come arm in arm with. But in organizations like the center, then you really have a chance to connect and to share and to grow together and to fortify each other, because you really do, it's not that we're supposed to hide under a rock, I mean, it's super complicated kind of conversation, but you do need safe places to go and just really kind of let it all hang out, in ways that you just can't at work. And that the center lets us grow, it lets us share, it lets us be part of a community, not feel lonely in the business faith walk, which again was the calling that I felt most assured by, when, on that next day after getting knocked off my horse, I mean, it seemed like, okay, life had changed forever in a moment at that point in time. And I was, a young professional, and I said, wow, I'm supposed to do something totally different here. And I was kind of a third-rate programmer at 25, just doing stuff, and my career just absolutely took off when I started following it. I mean, that testimony is actually, it still even amazes me, because the difference of the before and after, and what happened in my career and what happened in my ability to, know what to do was only explainable by God's hand and God's power and His empowering presence for me.